Dawn never truly owned Okinawa. Night did. April 1st, 1945. The humid winds swept across the sugarcane fields, carrying the stench of gunpowder and wet earth. Along the coral ridges, Japanese soldiers lay still as stone, waiting for their moment, that familiar hour when the darkness became their ally. But tonight the dark would betray them. Amid the sea of Garands and Thompsons, only 150 men carried something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction dream. The M3 infrared carbine, a weapon that turned the night into a pale green mist. No flares, no muzzle flashes, only faint silhouettes appearing through a ghostly scope and vanishing a second later. Okinawa was the final step before Japan itself. And for the next 82 days, the question would no longer be who shoots faster, but who sees first. For the first time in the history of war, the night no longer belonged to Japan. April 1945. The sky above southern Japan was the color of lead. Below it lay a small island called Okinawa, soon to become the stage for the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. On the decks offshore, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers stared toward the island, while their generals knew one thing: this was the final door before Japan itself. For Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the 10th Army, Okinawa was not just a battle. It was a calculation. "Take Okinawa," he said, "and you hold the key to Tokyo." But across the island, General Mitsuru Ushijima of the Imperial Japanese Army understood the truth even better. He had transformed every meter of Okinawa into a fortress. He could not win the daylight, but he could still own the night. Okinawa was the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, only 550 kilometers from Kyushu. Its terrain was a nightmare. Sharp coral ridges, narrow gullies, thick cane fields hiding thousands of natural caves. To the Japanese, it was a ready-made hell, a labyrinth built for men who refused to surrender. When U.S. forces landed on April 1st, they met no resistance, no gunfire, only silence, the kind that always comes before a storm, because in that silence, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers waited for nightfall. From Guadalcanal to the Philippines, Americans had already learned one rule: what you take in daylight, you must defend in blood after dark. Night was Japan's most trusted weapon. They moved like shadows, attacked without warning, and vanished before dawn. They cut phone lines, crawled through fences, and slit throats in silence. No artillery, no armor, just darkness. Reports from New Guinea described men sleeping with their eyes open. One crack of a twig could send an entire company scrambling for their rifles. A single yawn could be the last sound a man ever made. Ushijima planned to repeat that nightmare on Okinawa, a place where every night would become hell. By 1942, U.S. soldiers understood something bitter. They could outgun the Japanese, but they could not outlast the fear of night. At Guadalcanal, thousands were killed not in battle, but in their sleep. The Japanese owned the dark. Every night, screams tore through the jungle. Every morning, someone was missing. Sergeant William Morrison of the 32nd Division later said, "You didn't see them. You only heard the whisper, and by sunrise, your buddy was gone." Darkness had become the enemy itself. The Japanese didn't just fight in it, they became it. But in a quiet corner of Virginia, at Fort Belvoir, a small team of engineers began asking a question that sounded insane at the time. What if we could see in the dark? And from that madness came the spark that would change war forever. In 1943, as the war reached its brutal midpoint, the U.S. Army's Electronic Research Branch began working on something unheard of: a handheld infrared scope. Radar already existed, but vision, seeing through pure darkness, that belonged only to dreams. At Fort Belvoir, a group of young engineers combined three strange technologies: an infrared beam invisible to the eye, a photoelectric converter that turned that beam into a green image, and a power source strong enough to carry it into battle. The result was the T-120 sniper scope, weighing more than 30 pounds, mounted on the light M1 carbine. When switched on, walls of black turned into fields of ghostly green. Every movement, every outline revealed. One officer wrote in his test report, "For the first time we shot at what no one else could see. Only the scope could." Within a year, the design became field-ready. By early 1945, 1,700 infrared units were completed. About 150 of them were loaded onto ships bound for one place: Okinawa. The M1 carbine had never been a frontline rifle. It was small, light, meant for rear guards and radio men, but its size made it perfect for the experiment. Engineers replaced the iron sights, added a mounting rail, and ran a cable from the scope to a 6-volt lead-acid battery pack, worn like a backpack. The whole system weighed more than 15 kilograms, but it gave its user the power to see in absolute darkness. They called it the T3 carbine, though most soldiers simply called it the night gun. The operators were hand-picked marksmen, each team of two, one shooter, one carrying the battery and observing. They trained in silence, learned to tell the difference between a moving branch and a crawling man, to control their breathing until the screen flickered with life. Their instructor said quietly, "When you look through that scope, you stop being a man. You become the eye of the dark." As the Americans placed their faith in science, the Japanese placed theirs in spirit. They believed courage could defeat machines. And for years they were right. They had triumphed in the night on countless islands. But Okinawa would be different. Here science would face instinct. A nation of warriors against a handful of engineers. One side trying to keep the night, the other ready to steal light from God himself. And neither knew, as they prepared for the invasion, that those 150 rifles were about to change the history of warfare forever. April 1st, 1945. The East China Sea roared like a wounded beast. From dawn to dusk, American naval guns rained over 44,000 shells onto the island of Okinawa, the largest bombardment in Pacific history. Each explosion tore new craters into the coral hills, where the Japanese had carved bunkers deep into the rock. When the smoke finally cleared, the 10th Army began its landing. On the western beaches, the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Divisions led the assault. To the south, the 7th and 96th Infantry advanced through Kadena's flatlands. Still, no gunfire, no resistance, only the sound of the sea. The Americans, stunned, believed the enemy had been wiped out by the shelling. They were wrong. Ushijima's army was not destroyed. It was waiting in the dark. For 3 days, U.S. troops pushed inland nearly 10 kilometers. The fields of sugarcane were empty, villages abandoned. Reports came back. Enemy weak, little contact. An officer even joked, "If the whole war's this easy, we'll be home by Christmas." Then came the first night, and with it, the true face of Okinawa. Small Japanese raiding teams slithered through the grass, cutting wires, tossing grenades, and vanishing again. There was no warning, no firelight, just the screams that followed. In 20 minutes, one company of the 96th Division lost 12 men. Sentinels had their throats slit mid-yawn. Radio stations fell silent. By dawn, the survivors whispered to each other, "They're everywhere." The ground itself moves. The Americans realized what Okinawa really was: Not Saipan, not Guam, but a place where the night itself was an enemy. Amid that chaos, on the northern flank near Shuri, a small detachment from the 96th Infantry Division was ordered to test a strange new weapon. The T3 carbine with the infrared sniper scope. No one quite knew what to expect. Private Robert Chun later wrote in his diary, "It looked like something out of a Buck Rogers comic. A carbine with a headlamp and wires running to a battery pack that weighed more than a dog." The first field test began on April 6th. The sky was pitch black, rain falling softly. Japanese troops began their usual crawl across the open field. Unaware they were walking into history. Chun lay behind a low berm, the T-120 scope glowing a faint green against his eye. At first he saw only fog, then shapes. 3 figures, creeping low, 70 yards away. He couldn't hear them, but he could see every motion as if through mist. The lead soldier raised his hand to signal. Chun squeezed the trigger. The carbine coughed once, the flash hidden by the T-23 suppressor. Through the scope, the figure fell. 2 more followed seconds later. For the first time, Chun wrote, "I killed a man who never knew I was there." By morning, men found 6 Japanese bodies lying across the field. No bullet holes visible at first. No one understanding what had happened. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the Americans had ghost rifles. Captured prisoners muttered the same thing. The darkness no longer protects us. The myth terrified them. They began lighting flares preemptively, throwing smoke grenades to hide. But every flare only betrayed their position. Those 150 night vision carbines, though scattered among thousands of troops, had turned fear itself into an American weapon. The night had flipped. Before Okinawa, American soldiers dreaded the dusk. Every sunset meant another round of terror. They huddled close, rifles clutched, praying for daylight. Now something had shifted. They began patrolling outward instead. The hunted had become the hunters. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez from the 7th Division recalled, "Through the scope, they moved like in a slow green movie, crawling, careful, thinking they were invisible. Then they just dropped. The night went quiet, almost peaceful. Almost. In the first week, U.S. reports estimated 30% of Japanese rifle casualties were caused by these infrared carbines. A staggering ratio, considering there were only 150 units. The generals called it the ghost effect. A small weapon, a simple beam of light unseen to the naked eye, had begun to break an entire army's faith in darkness. For generations, Japanese soldiers had trained to own the night. They prided themselves on hearing wind through bamboo, telling footsteps from rain. They moved silently, killed silently. But now nothing worked. A surviving soldier from the 62nd Division later testified, "We moved perfectly. No sound, no mistake. Yet bullets found us in the dark. The Americans had eyes like ghosts." Reports to the Japanese High Command describe strange phenomena. Men shot before reaching the lines. Entire patrols wiped out without a sound. Soldiers vanishing mid-step. Some called it the God's punishment. Others simply stopped going out at night. The Imperial Army, once master of nocturnal war, was now afraid of its own shadow. The M3 carbine was not invincible. It was heavy, fragile, and hated the rain. Humidity fogged the scope. A single drop of water could short the wiring. The lead-acid battery lasted barely 4 hours. Each night, operators carried spare packs, each weighing 6 pounds, and if the power faded, the world went black instantly. Private Chun described that moment. "When the light died, it was like someone gouged out my eyes. In one raid, a team lost power mid-watch. The Japanese crawled right over them. By morning, one man was missing. They found his body later. Scope shattered, weapon buried under mud. Technology could see through darkness, but not through madness itself. April 12th, 1945. The battle for Okinawa was deepening. Ushijima's men retreated into the Shuri line, a vast network of caves and tunnels carved into the hills. Every night they launched desperate raids on U.S. supply lines. But this time, it wasn't easy prey. Infrared teams now dotted the perimeter, tiny green eyes waiting in the rain. Radar picked up movement. The scope switched on. The jungle bloomed in phosphorescent green. Each crawling silhouette glowed like a lantern, each motion answered by a silent shot. By dawn, entire infiltration units had ceased to exist. The night, once Japan's shield, had turned into a killing field. Major James Patterson of the 24th Corps noted in his after-action report, "Psychological impact decisive. Japanese troops lost faith in night operations. Infiltration reduced by 60% within 1 week." For the first time in the Pacific War, American troops walked confidently in darkness. They patrolled without fear, reclaimed lost ground at night. When soldiers realized they could see, fear itself collapsed. That confidence changed the rhythm of the campaign. Japanese counterattacks faltered, their secret tunnels discovered, their ambushes spoiled before they began. Okinawa's night, once alive with whispers and steel, became silent. U.S. commanders quickly saw the broader potential. The M3 wasn't just a defensive tool. It became a forward observer's dream. Infrared teams began spotting for artillery, marking targets for night airstrikes, and even guiding Sherman tanks through unlit valleys. Maps of Okinawa gained a new symbol, IROP, Infrared Observation Point. Tiny dots on paper, but a revolution in how war was fought. As one officer remarked, "They thought we had second sight. All we had were batteries and glass." Night, once the realm of instinct, was now charted, measured, and controlled by science. By mid-April, the meaning of darkness had changed forever. Daylight now belonged to artillery. Night belonged to technology. A field report captured it best. "We saw the enemy before he knew he was dead." It wasn't just victory, it was transformation. A moment when humanity crossed a line between seeing and killing. From that moment on, war would never again be blind. Okinawa had shown the world that light itself could become a weapon, and that once we took it from the darkness, we would never give it back. April 29th, 1945. Night fell over Okinawa like a curtain of oil. The ridges burned faintly red from the day's bombardment, and in the valleys the smell of rot and rain fused into something that clung to a man's lungs. For those still alive, it was no longer a battle. It was endurance inside a furnace that never cooled. The 32nd Japanese Army had lost half its strength. Still, every night they returned, crawling from tunnels, clutching Arisaka rifles, grenades tied to their belts. They no longer fought to win. They fought to delay the inevitable. American soldiers called it the Night of the Living Dead. But in the silent dark, under the steady hum of their infrared scopes, the hunters and the hunted began to blur. Private Robert Chun hadn't slept for 2 days. He wrote in his notebook, "The light burns through my eyelids even when the scope is off. I see green where there is only black." The T3 carbine had become an extension of his body, 34 pounds of metal, wire, and glowing glass. Every night he watched the world in shades of emerald. Men no longer had faces, only outlines. Trees breathed. Rocks pulsed. Anything that moved could be death. He could not remember the last time he'd heard silence. The infrared scope emitted a constant faint whine, a nervous sound, like a mosquito in the ear. And yet to the operators it became comforting. That hum meant you could still see. When the battery faded, when the hum stopped, you were blind again. By May, Okinawa had turned into a graveyard disguised as a battlefield. The rain season arrived. Mud buried boots, guns, even corpses. The air buzzed with flies thick enough to blacken the light. Japanese soldiers dug deeper into the limestone hills, creating what Marines called the honeycomb. Each cave was a fortress. One entrance, no retreat. Inside, hundreds of men waited in the dark, breathing the same air until it turned metallic. They whispered prayers to ancestors who no longer answered. At night they emerged to strike, but the strikes grew fewer and fewer returned. The M3 infrared teams had spread across the island like silent sentinels. Their scopes pierced the mist, catching faint silhouettes before they reached American lines. For the Japanese, it was as if the island itself had gained eyes. Every move, every whisper, seen. On May 5th, the rain became a wall. Visibility dropped to nothing. Mudslides carried trucks into ditches. Radio lines failed. It was the perfect cover, or so the Japanese believed. At 0200 hours, a company of Imperial soldiers launched a desperate infiltration near the Maida Escarpment, a narrow ridge Americans called Sugarloaf Hill. For 3 nights they crawled through swamp and wire, unaware that ahead of them lay 3 infrared teams waiting in the storm. Private Alan Brower of the 7th Division recalled, "We couldn't see 10 feet ahead, but through the scope, the rain glowed like silver. They looked like ghosts walking through a curtain of light. At 70 yards, the operators opened fire, single muffled shots. In minutes, 20 men fell. The survivors broke, running into a crossfire they couldn't locate. By dawn, Brower's position was surrounded by bodies, their rifles still clutched tight, eyes wide open, as if still trying to see what had killed them. It was no longer combat, it was execution by light. Back at command, reports arrived hourly. Enemy infiltration attempts decreasing. Night activity minimal. Officers celebrated, but the soldiers at the front felt something else, a quiet unease. The more they killed unseen, the more unreal it became. Some refused to sleep near their scopes. Others claimed to see movement even when the lenses were off. Corporal David Kim wrote in his diary, "They say we own the night, but sometimes I feel the night owns us." For every Japanese soldier terrified by the unseen, an American carried the weight of being the unseen killer. The carbine had given them control, but it had taken away recognition. There were no faces, only targets. No blood, only the flicker of green shadows collapsing into stillness. Desperation breeds invention. By mid-May, the Japanese attempted crude countermeasures. They covered helmets with mud to reduce reflection. Some burned wet leaves to create smoke barriers. Others tied mirrors to bamboo poles, waving them in the dark to mislead scopes. It didn't work. Infrared ignored camouflage and mirrors. The heat of a human body shone like a lantern against the cold background. A captured officer confessed, "We thought it was witchcraft. No man should see like that." The psychological effect was catastrophic. Entire battalions began refusing night missions. Commanders ordered soldiers to fight only at dawn. The night foxes of the Imperial Army had vanished, replaced by men who feared shadows. The M3's success came at a cost. The operators became isolated, elite, envied, but cursed. Their gear made them slower, heavier, easier targets for snipers during the day, and their mental state deteriorated fast. Battery acid burns were common. A single hit to the pack could electrocute the user. Many carried spare fuses wrapped in waterproof tape, their hands scarred from rewiring circuits under fire. The scope's glow ruined night vision permanently. Veterans complained they could never sleep without seeing green haze behind their eyelids. One technician wrote, "We made them see in the dark, and now they can't stop seeing." By late May, the fight had shrunk to the Shuri line, a 10-mile defensive maze stretching across southern Okinawa. Every hill hid caves linked by tunnels. Every cave hid men prepared to die. The Americans advanced yard by yard. Flamethrowers cleared entrances. Demolition charges sealed exits. But at night, it was the infrared teams who guarded those silent slopes. The only eyes in a world swallowed by rain and death. They saw what no one else could. Japanese medics carrying the wounded, officers whispering in the dark, priests blessing dying men. Sometimes they didn't shoot. Sometimes they lowered their weapons and simply watched, unsure whether mercy or exhaustion guided their hands. Private Kim later wrote, "They weren't ghosts. They were men like us, trapped in the same night." As the rain poured harder, scopes fogged, lenses cracked, and batteries ran dry. One by one, the green eyes across the line went out. The teams fell back to recharge, leaving the night unguarded for the first time in weeks. That night, hundreds of Japanese soldiers stormed the perimeter. The fighting was savage, hand to hand. Flamethrowers lit up the sky like false dawn. Men clawed at each other in the mud, bayonets and screams indistinguishable in the storm. When daylight came, the American line still held, but barely. Of the 12 infrared operators stationed there, 7 were dead. Their scopes smashed, battery packs ripped open, bodies half buried in mud, still connected by their own wires. A lieutenant found Chun's diary, soaked and half torn. The last line read, "I can still see them when I close my eyes. The green won't go away." In the final weeks, the psychological gap widened beyond repair. Japanese morale disintegrated. Reports mentioned soldiers breaking down, screaming at empty air, refusing to move after sunset. American troops began describing them not as enemies, but as apparitions. Yet even victory carried its own corruption. The soldiers who had once feared the dark now looked into it with something colder: detachment. Each trigger pull was a small godlike act, and gods, they learned, don't sleep well either. By May 30th, the 32nd Army ceased organized resistance. Okinawa had become a wasteland of bones and rain. The M3 units, most of them exhausted or broken, were recalled for repair. In total, those 150 infrared carbines had accounted for nearly 1/3 of Japanese small arms casualties in the sector. But statistics could not measure what had changed. For the first time, the boundary between human and machine had thinned. Men had looked through glass and seen death before it arrived. They had stolen sight from the night, and with it, a piece of their own humanity. One field chaplain wrote in his report, "They brought light into darkness, but left a darker place inside themselves." The war was not over, but something fundamental had ended. From now on, darkness would never be trusted again. June 1945, the rain stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. Okinawa, once green and alive, now lay broken, its hills carved open by artillery, its fields flooded with blood and salt water. The battle that began on April 1st had lasted 82 days, and for both sides it had turned into a descent into something darker than war itself, a struggle for the soul of night. When the last Japanese guns fell silent, it wasn't victory that echoed through the ridges. It was the hum of generators, powering the infrared scopes one final time. The men who had once hunted in green shadows now looked across an island that no longer had any secrets left to show. American intelligence estimated over 77,000 Japanese soldiers killed. Another 7,000 surrendered, the highest number in the Pacific, but still only a fraction of the dead. Entire regiments vanished inside the limestone caves of the Shuri line. Many officers took their own lives beside burning maps and shattered radios. The Shuri castle, once the symbol of Ryukyuan kings, was reduced to rubble by naval bombardment. Every square meter of its stones carried the scorch of flame and gunpowder. American Marines raised the flag over the ruins, not with triumph, but exhaustion. They had taken Okinawa, but what they carried home from it was heavier than victory. By the final weeks, Japanese night infiltration had nearly ceased. Reports recorded only scattered movements, small, disoriented groups wandering through smoke, no longer coordinated, no longer hunting. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson of the 24th Corps wrote in his after-action summary, "The enemy's ability to operate in darkness has been decisively broken. Where once they owned the night, they now fear it. The T3 carbine and its glowing green sight had erased one of Japan's most effective weapons, stealth. But in doing so, it revealed something else, how thin the line was between power and blindness." One Marine captain said quietly, "We learned to see everything, and somehow we stopped feeling anything." In early June, as mop-up operations continued in the south, infrared teams were ordered to maintain nightly observation along captured perimeters. There was little movement. The scopes showed only drifting smoke and shattered earth. Corporal David Kim recorded his final entry. "The night is empty now. No figures, no movement, just green rain falling on ghosts." 2 nights later, his unit switched off their scopes for the last time. The generators were silent. The darkness returned. But to those who had looked through that lens for months, it was no longer comforting. Once you had seen men die as green silhouettes, the dark could never again be trusted. After the surrender, American troops entered the cave complexes under Shuri. What they found was beyond comprehension. Caves filled with corpses, officers seated upright at tables, pistols in hand, messages still on their typewriters. Medical stations stacked with the dead and dying, some clutching photographs, others holding grenades that never detonated. One bunker contained a generator still running weakly after weeks of isolation. The light it powered flickered across a message scrawled in charcoal. "We fought in the dark. You made the dark disappear." The meaning wasn't lost on the men who read it. In a war built on discipline and faith, technology had rewritten the last line of defiance. Darkness, the one element Japan had always controlled, was no longer theirs. Okinawa's statistics defied proportion. More than 49,000 American casualties, including 12,500 dead. Over 77,000 Japanese soldiers perished. Tens of thousands of civilians caught between them. Yet from the perspective of modern warfare, the island became something else, a test site. The first real combat deployment of night vision warfare in human history. In the field data submitted to Washington, the conclusion was chillingly direct. Infrared-equipped carbines accounted for approximately 30% of all Japanese rifle casualties. Their effectiveness exceeds all expectations. The phrase that followed would define a century of military doctrine. Control of darkness equals control of the battlefield. Within months, the engineers at Fort Belvoir were already drawing up plans for a new generation of night vision equipment. Longer range, lighter batteries, improved optics. Contracts were issued for 20,000 complete systems. enough to equip entire divisions. But before mass production could begin, 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. The T-3 carbine was shelved, its next battlefield postponed for another decade. Yet its legacy was irreversible. When war returned in Korea, American soldiers carried the descendants of those first scopes. By Vietnam, night vision had become standard. The green world of Okinawa reborn in every jungle ambush. And today, every modern soldier who moves under the glow of a night vision goggle walks in the footsteps of those 150 men who first saw through the dark. Technology had won, but at a cost no one could calculate. For the men who had looked through those scopes, the green haze never faded. Medical reports from 1946 noted visual persistence, a phenomenon where operators continued seeing phosphons, the afterimage of light, even in total darkness. Psychologists called it night fixation syndrome. One veteran described it simply, "I close my eyes and I still see them, the ones who never saw me." The military called it combat stress. The men called it the ghost light. In every generation, new inventions promised to make war cleaner, safer, more efficient. But the M3's story revealed something deeper, that every time man learns to see better, he also learns to kill better. Okinawa was not just the end of a campaign, it was the moment humanity crossed a threshold, when the dark was no longer nature's domain, but ours. The T-3 carbine was crude by modern standards. A heavy battery, a fragile scope, a weapon that worked only 70 yards out. Yet it changed everything, because it wasn't a gun, it was a way of seeing. After the war, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer of the 32nd Japanese Army, was one of the few senior officers to survive Okinawa. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The Americans possessed a technology that defied nature. They saw us when we believed ourselves invisible. Their eyes were no longer human. Our soldiers lost the will to fight in the dark, and with it, they lost faith in victory itself." Yahara's words were not just an admission of defeat. They were a prophecy that the age of machines had begun and the battlefield would never again be equal ground. At dawn on June 22nd, the last organized Japanese defense collapsed near the southern cliffs. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army, performed seppuku in his underground command post. His adjutant read his final words aloud. "We fought as soldiers. Tell the Emperor, we gave everything." Outside, the sea was calm for the first time in months. The bodies of soldiers, American and Japanese alike, floated together in the tide indistinguishable beneath a thin film of oil. A surviving U.S. radio operator switched off his infrared scope and whispered, "It's finally dark again." But he didn't mean peace, he meant blindness, the return to a world that once hid mercy in the shadows. Only 1,900 T-3 carbines were ever produced before the war ended. Fewer than 150 saw combat, yet they redefined the balance of power on a battlefield, a weapon that allowed one soldier to see when 10,000 could not, a technology that erased fear for some and created new kinds of fear for everyone else. Historians later compared it to radar, to the atomic bomb, to the first computer. But for the men who carried it, it was none of those things. It was the sound of a battery humming in the dark. It was the reflection of their own eyes glowing green inside a piece of glass. It was the quiet understanding that humanity had just invented a new kind of sight and a new kind of loneliness. Years after the war, Okinawa rebuilt. Sugarcane grew again over the fields where the dead once lay. Children played among rusted helmets and broken bayonets. But at night, when fog rolled over the ridges, Locals claimed to see faint green lights drifting through the mist, as if the ghosts of that invisible war still patrolled the island. No one could prove it. No one wanted to, because perhaps in some way, the night still remembered those who had stolen its soul. In the end, the M3 carbine was more than a weapon. It was a threshold, a point where humanity stopped fearing the dark and began reshaping it. But every threshold has a price. To see everything means to lose something. On Okinawa in 1945, 150 soldiers learned what that meant: to carry light into hell and return never the same. The battle ended. The war ended. But the night never did.